Okay, good evening, friends. We're starting about 15 minutes late this evening because we had some tech issues. I'm always amazed when we have a tech problem, how rarely we have a tech problem. So Keshav is not with us this evening, and this is the time that would have been filled with him chanting, for those of you who are still with us. I'm going to start completely over because I think nothing was aired. We're working with the book In Divine Friendship by Swami Kriyananda. We are well through the book. Class 40-something is what we're working on. So let's start with the prayer and then we'll go into the book. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to open our hearts to your guiding presence, to know ourselves as we truly are, which is one with thy light. Help us to live consciously and carefully in attunement with your will, courageously and trustfully knowing that if we are sincere in our intentions, you will guide us and bless us and lead us home. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, my friends, let's see. We are in the last few paragraphs of this letter that I read last week, which is all about astrology, and astrology on such a level that there's really very little that I can contribute. Swami wrote a book in 1971 and 72 about astrology, your sun sign as a spiritual guide. He did not study astrology per se beyond a little bit. Mostly he meditated deeply and drew what he wrote in that book directly from intuition. And so now he wrote a long letter to a woman named Blanche Whitestar, who was a professional astrologer and a friend of his, putting forward to her some unusual theories and wanting to know her point of view. And I read several pages of it last week, doing my best to act like I knew what I was talking about. And now there's just a couple of more paragraphs and then we'll be done with this one. So Swami says, for a real consideration of the houses, therefore related to everything he said earlier, I think one should work with the sidereal chart, which is the Western system, as these concern, sidereal? Now I can't remember. As these concern our relationship to the totality of life, and not only to the solar question of how we shall impose our authority on others. Sidereal is the Eastern one, and the solar. But he wrote this book from the Western astrology point of view. So one of the things he's doing here is trying to reconcile the both. Of how we shall impose our authority on others. In this last sense, Mars and Uranus belong in my 10th house, which is where they are tropically. Tropical astrology is Western and sidereal is Eastern. I hope I have that right. But in the previous, more universal sense, Mars belongs with Jupiter in my 9th house, which is where it is sidereally. I'd really appreciate your views on this, so that if I'm really off base, I can know it before I commit any horrible blunders in the book I'm writing. This is how he was writing to her, because he was going to put himself out there with his new theories. But I must say it feels completely right to me and clarifies things that were never clear before without contradicting anything that has been claimed for the rising signs by long tradition. So this is how Swami tries to be orthodox. He has a lot of respect for tradition, but not limitless respect for tradition. So he wasn't just trying to innovate for its own sake, but when he really looked at it closely, his intuition gave him different answers. By the way, on the subject of solar returns, isn't the position of everything on one's birthday of that year supposed to indicate the trend of the whole subsequent year? Am I to take it from this that those influences haven't yet begun and won't begin until May 19th, my birth date? and that Saturn's placement right over my sun at that time is an influence that will hang over me for one whole year thereafter, even after Saturn has drifted off into Gemini in the following month? And that's the end of the letter, in divine friendship. P.S. People who don't so much externalize themselves, exert their authority, and who are by nature more receptive than aggressive, may manifest in their lives more their rising sign than their sun sign, right? And that's the end of the letter. We don't have Blanche's letter in response, so unless you have studied Swami Kriyananda's book and can make sense out of this letter in that book, that would be the answer to what Blanche might have said. Blanche altogether was very, very impressed with Swamiji and often commented when the occasion came up how remarkably astute he was about astrology, period, just objectively, but then astonishingly so, considered that he never actually studied it. He just got the basic system and then intuited it. So, moving along now to something I can understand more as really myself. This is a letter. We've now changed categories in the book. We were just, before we were in Insights and Commentary, which range from Ayn Rand, the author of many strong-minded political novels, politically oriented novels, to Swami talking to Blanche White Star about rising signs. So it was a bit of a catch-all. Now we're in the section called Leadership. And this was written in 1998, June of 1998. Someone asked for advice on how to be a leader. Big question. So Swami says, dear friend, the most important thing to keep in mind is that no position and no talent is more important than any other in the eyes of God. We are all of us simply serving God. I mean, Swami often said that he wouldn't make anyone a leader at Ananda who wanted to be a leader, meaning who had this idea in their mind that it was important for them to be a leader, or that being a leader would validate them, or in any way that it was personal. He put people in positions of leadership who had a desire to serve. And if you had a desire to serve and happened to have the talent, and even more importantly, had the karma to be a leader, then he would give that position to you. So he starts by saying that no position is more important in the eyes of God. This is also a slight departure from some spiritual organizations where people will feel that the higher you are up in the organization, by definition, the more spiritual you are. Swami always wanted to make it very, very clear at Ananda that people just served where it was their karma to serve. He tells an amusing story of when he visited this highly evolved saint in, it was actually, his name was Yogi Ramya. Master said he was completely free. He was a siddha, he was completely free spiritually. Swami spent some time with him, and the man had also exchanged some correspondence with Dayamata, who was then the president of Self-Realization Fellowship. And in order to understand some of the questions that she had been asking and the comments she'd been making, Yogi Ramya asked Swami what Dayamata's responsibilities were, what did her position entail. And Swami described this international organization with hundreds, thousands of members, and all of these different branches, and all of this real estate that had to be taken care of, and just this huge enterprise, which she was the president of the whole entity in both India and the U.S. And the yogi just shook his head and he said, what a burden, like this. And Swami said, well, would you say then that it's her bad karma to be in a position of leadership? And does it then follow that the higher your position, the worse your karma? I mean, Swami was teasing, but Yogi Ramya began to laugh. And he said, no, he said, in her case, it's her good karma, because having all those responsibilities gives her the opportunity to work out the karma. But it wasn't that, oh, she's the president, therefore she's so advanced. but having those responsibilities is a divine opportunity for her to resolve. Obviously operating on a high level like that gives you the opportunity to resolve many issues, to balance a great deal of karma, because it's such a high energy life, potentially. By contrast, Yogi Ramya had the most understated role. He was a fully liberated soul. He had very few disciples. He lived in this village, this humble village in India, and the people he shared the village with, Swami said, seemed to have no awareness of his spiritual greatness. And the yogi himself said he just talked to the villagers about the crops and about food. He said we talked to very few people. Swami couldn't help but say, given your state of realization, shouldn't you be doing more? And the yogi said, God has done what he wanted done through this body. But of course, such a being serves by his consciousness. He uplifts the planet just by his consciousness. Doing something is extra. Swami even says, I think in this book somewhere, that the concept of someone being a great master, it's redundant, because to be a master is to be completely free. So you can't be a great, greater, greatest. If you have the appellation of master, then you have transcended all limitation. So there's no way to say great or not great. But sometimes a master does have that adjective applied to him because he has a great mission to carry out. And again, that's not a sign of a higher state of realization. That's just the karma. Master himself constantly had positions of leadership. He was a king, he was a warrior, he was just a notable historical character. But that was his own destiny. So when Swami's here talking about leaders, he says, keep in mind that no position and no talent is more important than any other in God's eyes. We are all of us simply serving God. It is our honor to be able to do well whatever he gives us to do, but it is not our glory. So he makes a distinction there. We're honored to be able to serve, but it doesn't make us, the concept of glory, it doesn't make us glorious beings because we are able to serve. It's that we are privileged to be able to serve. And he also says it's essential, it is our honor to do well whatever he gives us to do. And this is also just an important part of it. If it's a responsibility that we have, being God-given, we have to apply ourselves with everything we have to it. It's incumbent upon us to do that. Not for personal importance, but because it's in the fitness of things that we should do so. It's actually really well explained in Swami's Bhagavad-Gita commentary. It was when I read that part of the commentary, and I don't know where it is. I'm doing another class during this period of time on a different night of the week, going through his commentary, and I don't think I've come to it yet. But the section is about the three gunas, the interplay of the three kinds of energy that constitute creation. And one of the definitions of a Satguru is Tri Guna Rahitam, which means he who has mastered the three gunas, which is he who is not compelled by the conditions of the material universe. And the three forces of the three gunas that play together are the darkening, downward pulling quality of Tamoguna, the activating quality of Rajoguna, and the Sattvic or uplifting quality. And all three of them are always playing together to make this creation. And they're all always influencing us. We have in us an inclination, a downward pulling inclination. Now, the more refined we are, the higher the bottom, so to speak. But nonetheless, all three gunas will still be at play, and so the darkening energy might not pull us into depravity, but it can pull us into laziness or self-concern or fear. The active quality is neither uplifting nor downward pulling. It has to be harnessed by one or the other, or else it just simply spins its wheels. This is a very, very Rajasic planet. America is a very, very Rajasic country. We're just always doing stuff. People are always busy and they're always doing stuff. We're very, very Rajasic. Much of our Rajas is downward pulling in the sense that it doesn't pull toward God. It just pulls toward greater and greater involvement with itself. And some of it these days is quite darkening. And sattvic is when we use that Rajasic energy to create light, to create beauty, to serve, to uplift our consciousness. But our journey as devotees, as we work out our karma, is to become master of the gunas, which is to not allow the darkening energy to pull us down, not allow the activating energy to dissipate our energy, but have everything moving in a sattvic direction till we escape completely from the downward pulling energy. And that is why we have to strive for excellence. It's not because excellence per se proves that we're a good person or something like that. It's because what keeps us from excellence is that we are compelled by tamasic or rajasic energy, or we have misunderstood the nature of sattvic energy. It's not, well, sometimes what looks like sattvic is really tamasic, which is a refusal to engage. That's why we have to be excellent, you see. So we strive for excellence because in doing so we master the gunas over us, and when we have mastered the influence of the gunas, we can transcend the need to act at all. So that's where he says, it is our honor to be able to do well whatever he gives us to do, but it is not our glory. It doesn't make us more important or better in the eyes of God. It's just simply a privilege that he gives us. It is good, in fact, for leaders deliberately to take on serviceful jobs occasionally, cooking, sweeping, washing dishes, simply to keep that perspective clear, that it's an honor to serve. And that's the real point. Whatever's given to us. When Swami Kriyananda was expelled from SRF in 1962, the perception of him at the time was that he was seeking self-aggrandizement rather than to serve his guru. And the people who had authority over him felt that he was not behaving properly, and they separated him from the organization. At that time, Swami was the head monk. He was working in India, and he was the vice president on the board of directors. Swamiji said, you know, I didn't come here for a position. I came here to serve. He said, take away all of the leadership positions I have. He said, I'll put it in writing if you want that I'll do nothing but wash dishes for the rest of my life within the Master's organization. And one of those who was making the decisions was astute enough to say, if you become a dishwasher, it will be a very short period of time before washing dishes is the most desirable and sought-after job in the organization. And in fact, Swami knew that was true, because it is an honor to do well whatever God gives us to do. And Swami would make dishwashing into a divine service, which it is. And that's why he says it's very good often for leaders to participate in what people might think of as the less glamorous jobs. It's not good in the Ananda context for a leader to be seen to have too much going on in terms of their position. For many years in the life of Ananda, I would say, let's say 69, 79, 89. You know, for almost 30 years, really. Swamiji, there were almost no accoutrements of his position, even though he was the complete leader. It was only actually after he left America and lived in Italy for a time, and the natural devotional nature of the Italians and their sort of long tradition of reverence for saints caused them to respond to Swamiji in a way that even if the impulse had been in the hearts of the Americans, Swami himself always kept it at bay. He discouraged it. He effectively never allowed it. And so he moved among us quite easily. And we respected him. I mean, many of us had profound reverence for him. But he wanted it to just move among us in an easy manner. But after he went to Italy, and also it was a different phase of his life, and a very much more reverential attitude became the norm there. When the Americans traveled to Italy and sort of saw that, we brought it back to America because it was our own feeling. And at that point, Swami began to let it flow. And then he moved to India, and there was no stopping it after that. But for a long, long time, it wasn't there. Respect was there. Deep respect was there. Great love was there. But it was kept simple. Very, very simple. So, I remember once in Encinitas, a group of us monks were leaving for Mount Washington. This was when Swamiji was living in the ashram with Paramahansa Yogananda from 1948 till 1952 when Master passed. And Master put Swamiji in charge of the monks. I remember once in Encinitas, a group of us monks were leaving for Mount Washington in a van that had only 2 seats in the front. Those sitting in the back had to make do with cushions. Dr. Lewis, who was Master's first disciple in America and who had a position on the board of directors of SRF, Swami did not have that position at that time. Dr. Lewis, seeing me sitting in the back, said, "You ought to be up front." "Why?" Swami asked. "Because," Dr. Lewis replied, "you're in charge of the other monks." "For that very reason," Swami said, "my place is here in the back." Swami writes, "I was surprised that Dr. Lewis couldn't see the obviousness of my reasoning." But then, Swami writes, he'd been a dentist all his life and not in a position of leadership over others. I mean, Swamiji knew that if he really wanted people to respect him, he had to not lord it over them. There's one comfortable seat, I'm going to take it. I mean, this is a time when Swami was 24 years old. I mean, when he was 80 and his body was frail and his bones hurt him and he had all these physical ailments, of course we insisted that he have the comfortable seat. It would have been ludicrous to put him in a cushion in the back. But when he was just a young man like all the others, they really needed to feel that he was with them rather than that he was always conscious of the fact that in some way special deference should be given to his position. He wanted the deference to be sincere and spontaneous and not the institutional culture. I mean, these are very important points that Swamiji worked with profoundly in Ananda to create a right understanding of this, because so many institutions, especially religious institutions, get very confused. And it's not only bad for the institution, it's very bad for the individual, because then you can't be yourself. You have to pretend to be this person because, after all, I'm the leader. I remember I was never very good at pretending. I remember in the early years when I was Swamiji's secretary, 94, 95, around in that time, and I was in my 20s, and I was pretty undisciplined, is about the only way I can think about it. I mean, I've always had a very emotional nature. It was intensely so at that time, and I don't know what was going on, but for some reason I was quite outspokenly off-center about something or another. And I was shopping in our little grocery store there on the Ananda property, and I was making some waves, and the reason for it I don't recall. But whatever I was doing, it was not attractive. And someone came up to me and said, you shouldn't be behaving like this because you're Swami's secretary. Well, they were right, absolutely. There was nothing laudable about my behavior, and it would have been nice if I hadn't been behaving that way. But I didn't like hypocrisy. And I said, well, I am his secretary, and this is how I'm behaving, so that's the way it is. It's like, what can I do? I can't just all of a sudden, put on a front. I just am who I am. And of course we should try to discipline ourselves to a higher standard, but we should do it because we are motivated to do it, not because in my position I have to put on a front. I have to show people that I'm spiritual, and their respect for me is because I appear to be spiritual. These are all very, very dangerous attitudes. And what is it to be spiritual? Swami has talked about this in other contexts. Too often people see it first from the outside and then try to mold themselves to it. Now, of course, there's a common sense. The spirit expresses itself in certain ways that are recognizable. But at the same time, we have to become those realities, or become so deep in our aspiration that we can guide ourselves in that way, so that it's deeply sincere. Hypocrisy is the death of spirituality, and hypocrisy is the death of religious institutions. So he was saying, Swamiji, of course, he took a humble role because that was appropriate. But Swami very kindly says Dr. Lewis didn't understand group dynamics. He'd been a dentist, and therefore he never had he never had to be in a position of leadership beyond the little work that he was doing, whereas Swami had this long karmic history of leadership. And then Swami goes on to give advice. Try drawing the others out. Ask for their advice, for instance, whenever possible, even if you don't really feel the need of it. This is the way of making others feel included. Swami was superb at that. It was many years before I realized that he was just drawing me out. He made me think he really needed my point of view. And then he goes on to say, if possible also, let them have the last word. That is to say, let them feel that you accept their suggestions, even if you've already had the same idea before asking them. After all, what does it matter where the idea comes from or who had it? So often a leader will say, you'll make a suggestion, and he'll say, yes, I thought of that myself. Yes, that's just what I was thinking. And so all of a sudden, it's not like you actually contributed anything, but you confirmed what he already knew. Now, of course, that can also be a supportive thing to say. But Swami says, if somebody comes up with a good idea, let it be their idea. And that's a way that people feel included and respected. And again, this is what Swamiji's idea of leadership is that you bring others up. You don't just have your position, but you do your best to make everyone else feel equal and valued. It's important not to give the impression that you've thought the whole thing through already and they were simply agreeing with your own conclusions. This kind of person leaves the other person thinking, why bother to make suggestions if they are neither needed nor wanted? And of course, the leader does that to show how wise he is. This is not a good way of developing team spirit, nor of encouraging leadership qualities in others. It is much better, as I said, to leave others thinking that an idea is theirs, even if, in fact, you've already had it yourself. As I said, Swami was so good at soliciting our advice, so good at discussing things with us, that it was decades before it occurred to me that he was just cultivating my ability to think clearly, that he didn't need me as much as I felt he needed me. But he really did. How do I want to say that? He wasn't being hypocritical. He was being absolutely sincere. And he genuinely rejoiced when I had good ideas because it was promising for me. He trained me in leadership, basically. Trained me in leadership by modeling it, and trained me in leadership by encouraging me to be creative and supporting me when I was. Swami said even often he would follow someone else's suggestion even if he knew his own idea was better, just in order to allow them to have the experience and to gain the confidence. The important thing in this context, though, is not to be swayed from your own inner center and not to accept ideas that are likely to put your overall plans at risk. So this is like the balancing line that Swami walked. Don't just turn the decision-making over to others. It's your responsibility. And especially don't turn over the decision-making if it's going to take things in a direction that you know is not the proper direction. So in your desire to support people, don't give over the reins. Don't just let anybody's ideas rule. I was having a conversation with someone not too long ago, and they were complaining about the fact that the group, the team, the small team that they were working with, some of the ideas of that small team were not really consistent with the overall vision. And the person was lamenting to me, I don't want to have to be, and they used the word, the attunement police. And I said, of course you have to be the attunement police. What do you think your job is? Your job as leader is to know what the vision is and to keep the energy moving in attunement, in accordance with that vision. And if the people that you're working with who are not in charge as you are, consistently bring up ideas that are going to take it off track, it's your job to keep it on track. But as Swami said in a completely other place, he said, when there's a straying from the fundamental vision, he said it's either a problem of communication, that the leader has not made it clear enough what they're trying to accomplish, why they're trying to accomplish, and how to get to it. Either there's a breakdown of communication or there's a breakdown of consciousness. And the consciousness, by that he means that you really aren't on the same page. You really aren't even seeing it the same way, and you need to help shift the consciousness of the people you're working with. You have to inspire them. You have to educate, and above all, you have to inspire them somehow so that with the vibration that you're trying to get across, that they'll be able to feel it, be attracted to it, and rise to it. That's what leadership is. And Swami says sometimes that's not possible. Then you have to, all kinds of things happen, but he's not being that detailed here. So he says, so the important things, though, is not to be swayed from your own inner center and not to accept ideas that are likely to put your overall plans at risk. So Swamiji would conduct these wonderfully open discussions, but he never really let go of the reins. He never said, okay, you decide what to do. Okay, he would never just say, well, here we are, what shall we do? He would always lay a direction. He would always, I can't ever remember a meeting where Swami didn't make it clear to us first where we were going, and even some tentative ways to get there. And then he would draw input and be very open to input, but he didn't just lay it out and say, what do you think? Meaning without first putting forth a strong ray of consciousness himself. It's a very interesting balance. And some people working with Swami didn't think he was really receptive because he wouldn't give over the fundamental vibration of what he was trying to accomplish. And so he says it right here. It's important in this context that you not be swayed from what you know is right. So, within the larger framework, however, it is often possible to go along with second or even third-rate ideas without risking anything serious, if in the process there's a chance of helping to develop in others a greater sense of responsibility. So that's what I was saying earlier. He would go with your ideas as long as they were fundamentally going where he was going, but he wouldn't let go of it enough to derail it. And of course, he had a very sensitive awareness of that, which is a highly cultivated leadership skill. But knowing what the process is makes you much more likely to be carried out properly. It is also important to have the patience to draw others into your creative flow. Otherwise, you'll find them grumbling that their energy and creativity seem to be held cheap. And of course, you don't mean to do that at all, So give them a chance to shine. And here is where, the subtlety of it comes from. Give people a chance to shine, give them a chance to express their creativity and do their work, but don't ever let go of the fundamental vision. But Swamiji criticized the leader of another well-known and very successful community, which was Peter Caddy, because he had an opinion all the way down to the smallest details. The table, the color of the tablecloths, the centerpieces, or that on that level. Swamiji would, if he thought that the overall direction was in place and the flow was in place, he would allow people to make as many decisions as he could that were merely peripheral to the central flow of energy. I mean, like, for example, we're having an event, we know what the intention is, Swami's in charge of the program, somebody else can decorate, somebody else can decide what's on the stage. Swami doesn't have to follow it all the way down to the bottom. Some leaders do, and then everybody else feels really stifled, they never have a chance. But sometimes people would try to take away from him the right to define things on a level that Swami would not allow. So it was always very interesting to watch. As for yourself, Swami's saying, don't ever think of shining. Just think of doing as well as possible whatever needs to be done, and of getting others to help you do it. When we were at a certain stage of litigation, during the 12 years from 1990 that we had to go through, and Ananda itself and Swami was being very personally attacked. Let me think how to say this. Let me think what the point was. Just a second. Oh, and a lawsuit was filed against us that was actually literally a boilerplate lawsuit against cults. And the lawyer who filed it had actually sued other groups, and it was a lawsuit he'd used before, and in a few places the wrong organization was named. And so it was what I would call a boilerplate accusation against what you would consider to be an abusive leader, and they just went through everything and just accused him of everything. And now let's see, what was the point I wanted to say there? I keep losing the point. Oh, yes. And he was accused of being dictatorial and imposing on everyone and so on like this. And it was very interesting because I just lived with Swami just the way he was. I didn't think about it that much. Well, I did, but I never thought of it in a negative way. But when I really started considering it, I realized that almost never did Swami actually tell anyone what to do. He actually spoke of 2 instances in all his years when he actually told people to do something, and there was profound moral issues involved that the people were not responding appropriately to, and he took a stand and basically said, "You will." In both of them, people turned against him. But Swami led by enthusiasm. He was just so enthusiastic about what he was doing, so happy to serve Master, so full of wonderful creative ideas, and he was really happy if you were inspired by it to come along. Hey, we could do this. Come to my house this afternoon. We'll talk about how to make it happen. We'll go to San Francisco. We'll open the center there. We'll do a program here. I have an idea for a series of classes. Maybe we can put on this event. I've been thinking about this book. I've been thinking about this class series. Come over and we'll talk about it. But he never said, you will do this. This is your job. You must do that. This is what you have to do. He just had all this wonderful flow of energy, and it was just so much fun to be with him. You ran along behind him. And he was the exact opposite of telling you what you had to do, but he inspired you to want to do it. And therefore, many people were very enthusiastic about following in his wake. And lesser minds just assumed there had to be a coercive element to that. But between inspiration and inspiring magnetism and authoritarian coerciveness, I mean, they're in different universes. And you were those of us who were enthusiastic about Swami were because we were, not because he made us be so. So he says, as for yourself, don't ever think of shining. Just think of doing as well as possible whatever needs to be done, and of getting others to help you do it. Jyotish describes, he recently was talking about the anniversary of the day he met Swamiji, and he knocked unannounced on the door of Swami's apartment in San Francisco, and this was a joke. And Swamiji was about to go out on a picnic with some friends, but first he was finishing a mailing or something like that. And he welcomed Jyotish and said, his name was John at that point, he said, I'm working on a project, perhaps you could help me. Meaning, we're going to finish this before we're going to go on the picnic. And Jyotish said, sure. And he said he didn't realize it was a 55-year project. But he did. He helped a little bit, and then they went out on the picnic, and the rest is history. But that was Swami's way. He was just doing what he was doing. He was enthusiastic. He invited you to help him. And it was so much fun to help him that you just stayed for the rest of your life, as it were. I find this helps even when something so dependent on my own creativity is involved as writing music or a book. Suggestions from others may always prove helpful. Often, I admit, the feedback I get strains my patience, and I have to remind myself that it is God's work, not mine, and that He may indeed sometimes say something useful through others. When Swami was writing what became the New Path, but was just called The Path at the time, 1974-75, in that era, he would have these Thursday night satsangs at his house, his dome, and he would invite the community to come in, and he would read to us the chapters that he'd written that week. And for Swamiji, this writing of this book was a really important enterprise, because he was writing about Master. No one had published a book like this at all. In fact, even to this day, no one's ever published a book like Swami did. And he was wanting to move very consciously, and it was to make sure that he was doing what Master wanted and wasn't wandering off into some kind of wilderness of misunderstanding. So he would gather us. There were 30 or 40 people there. And then he would read us the chapters, and then he would ask what we thought. And he really needed our response, because if you're writing all by yourself, sometimes you just don't realize, how it reads. Because sometimes you say things that are crystal clear to you, and then other people will hear it in a way that you never even imagined. And he also wanted to just reading it out loud to other people's minds, feeling their minds. It often, I know this from experience, it often illuminates for you either what's strong or weak in what you've written. And he was writing it for us, meaning he was writing it for people like us. And so our response to it was relevant. He wasn't writing it just for the exercise of doing it. It wasn't a diary. It was meant to be a book for other people. But people just didn't know how to respond. Now, in truth, it wasn't always easy to respond, because you would say, sir, I really just didn't understand that paragraph. I don't know what you mean by X, Y, or Z. And he would say things like, what do you mean? It's perfectly clear. And you had to be able to stand up to that and say, no, sir, it's not clear to me. This is how I heard it. What did you intend? So he put out a lot of energy. But finally, Swami got very frustrated with us, because he said, quote, we're treating him like a television. Or he used the word Nickelodeon, which you put in a nickel and then the program plays. He says, I need your help. And he really did. He really needed our help. He said sometimes the suggestions tried his patience. He admitted that. But also many times God would speak through the people who were speaking. And Swami would often make changes in his writing based on the feedback and what it would communicate to him. It wasn't even always what we said, but the interaction would illuminate for Swamiji somewhere he needed to go or something that needed to be shifted. Sometimes mistakes were comical. This became, for many years, with Swami, it was sort of a joke. He was talking about his college time, and he had this roommate who was from South America, maybe Argentina, I'm not sure where. But Swami described this man as an ideal roommate. He was thoughtful, he was studious, he was quiet, he was tall. and Swami's reading this out loud, or maybe I read it later, I don't recall. But sir, like, were there a lot of shelves that were hard to reach in your apartment? Light bulbs that went out and you didn't have a footstool, like you had to advertise for someone tall or else you couldn't live in the apartment. And of course, Swami just laughed because he was picturing his roommate and he was picturing his dignified nature and the fact that he was tall. But that's trivial, but you can make all kinds of mistakes in writing that you don't realize are there until somebody else sees it, or the thought, even as you read it, it's this very interesting phenomenon. Even as you read it, you feel people misunderstanding it, whereas you understood it perfectly because you knew what you wanted, but you feel their misunderstanding, and then you actually see that the misunderstanding is inherent in what you wrote, but you didn't know it. So he really insisted that we raise our energy and respond to him. So he says, I find that getting others to help is important even when it's his own creativity, it's his own music, whatever it might be. Okay. As a matter of fact, Swami says, often I admit the feedback I get strains my patience, and I have to remind myself that it is God's work, not mine, and that he may indeed sometimes say something useful through others. As a matter of fact, he often does. Mine, then, is the job of sifting and of not allowing myself to be drawn out of the inspiration I feel in the project. This takes effort sometimes, and a strong hold on patience and willpower. But I found it proves worthwhile on many levels, to the project itself and to the overall dynamic of group spirit. So quite apart now from reading, Swami's saying, this is the challenge. You have to bring everybody in. You have to have the discussion. You have to genuinely listen. You have to really give them space to have their ideas. And you have to have sufficient patience and willpower not to lose the central inspiration that you're working on. I mean, this is an extremely high level. It's a very high level of leadership. And, Swamiji was masterful at it. He would let us talk. He would hear our different points of view. He would respond to them. He would not block the conversation. But then he would always sift through it, just exactly like he's saying, sift through it and give intelligent, considered feedback to the ideas we had so that he could win us through communication and inspiration to where he was going. And then often in that process, what would happen is our own thinking would clarify, and often we would have a better idea now that we understood where he was going and what was wrong with this idea. And also, we learned to think. He taught us how to think. So instead of just blurting out ideas and feeling hurt if they're not accepted, we learned by watching him sift through the many ideas. Well, that's a good idea, but if we did it that way, then it might be perceived like this. Oh, yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought of it. But this part of the idea was good, so maybe if we go this way. And at the end of it, we not only accomplished things, but Swami developed people. And developing people is really what a leader is supposed to do. In some context or another, I believe it was Swami who said that the medium of a leader's expression is other people's energy. You're a creative artist with other people's energy if you're a good leader, which is a wonderful way to think about it. And it's not for everyone. Swami had an interesting combination of talents where he was extremely creative in his own right, but he could also be very creative with other people's energy as his medium. And it's complicated. but it's all skills worth developing, which is why we have this whole section on leadership. So that's the end of the letter. May Master bless you always, he says. So we're in the same time of year. In fact, this might be to the same person. Let's see what the date is. This was June 26th, and the next day, on June 27th, 1998, Swami writes an additional note about how to delegate authority. Here's a thought you might find helpful, one that you could share also with others. In delegating authority, don't just turn a job over to others as if washing your hands of it. Expand your consciousness, rather, to include them and what they are doing in that job. Make them and what they do a part of your own reality. Swamiji was really powerful in the way he operated, and there's a book that was written by Nishala, and it was, I wish I could tell you the name of it. It was a collection of interviews that she wrote and edited from the people who at that time were the leaders of Ananda, just about their life. It was all about community. And two of the people, in telling stories, talked about, and they told the story just with loving humor, making something amusing out of it. And it was in both cases that Swamiji had handed them a huge responsibility, wished them luck, and then just left them to carry it on. When Swami read the book, which he liked very much, it is extremely well done, and he in both cases, he called them on the telephone, and he said, "I never left you alone." He said, "My consciousness was always with you." And he actually made them republish the book because he felt it was such a misleading statement about the way he worked with people that he didn't want it to remain in print. My recollection is they had to reprint the book and change that to be more true. Now, the people saying that were not really trying to make a deep philosophical statement. They were just more or less making a joke, because Swami wasn't physically present, and Swamiji wasn't holding their hand and telling them step by step, but my consciousness never left you. And this is how he's saying right here, this is how you delegate authority. You give people the opportunity to be the one who's carrying it out, but you never abandon them in your consciousness. Rather, you expand your consciousness to include what they're doing as your own reality. Now, in another place completely, Swami talked about that even more. And he said it's always been his way to lead by magnetism those who are receptive to the inspiration he offers. And he explained essentially in these words, I've written it up in Light Bearer is exactly how he put it. He said those who are receptive to his guidance, he projects thoughts and ideas, and if they are receptive to his guidance, they will receive those thoughts, and if those thoughts resonate with their own vibration and their own moment in time moving forward, they will absorb those ideas into themselves, develop them, and then they will really become that person's ideas. Now, I hope that's a clear explanation, because I have lived through it. Because 30 years ago, I moved from the community where Swami Kriyananda still lived, which was Ananda Village, where I was in almost daily contact with him, took on the responsibility for developing what has now become the Mountain View Ananda Palo Alto community. And during the whole time that I was working here, especially when we were really having to create something that had never been created before, because this was not the first urban center, but the development of urban centers was just beginning to happen. So we were really pioneering. And there was this powerful sense all during that time that we always knew what to do. We just always knew what to do. It wasn't, we just didn't have to agonize about it. It was just always there what to do. The next step was always right in front of us, and it was just clear, very clear how to proceed. And of course, part of it was I knew I'd been very well trained because I'd had 16 years of close association with Swami, and I paid a lot of attention. But gradually I realized it was much more than that. It wasn't merely that I'd been well trained, it was that he was actually acting through me. It was just, there was no other way to say it. Thoughts are universal, they're not individual. And so we receive thoughts and inspirations from whatever vibration we're in tune with. And of course, as disciples, we ask to be guided by the Guru. As devotees of Ananda, Master's inspiration flows powerfully through Swami. For me personally, everything I understood about the spiritual path, I understood from Swamiji. He was the pole star to me. And so constantly, as a constant get up in the morning and have breakfast, this is just the way I lived and live. I'm always referencing everything in terms of what he said, what he taught, what he did. Sometimes I hear myself, just even in dinner table conversation, just whatever subject comes up, I just offer what I know Swami said about it or the incident or whatever happened, because how else would I know what to do? How else would I know what is true? And then years later, many years later, I think it was when I was even writing this book, that I discovered these words, which were in my own notes. But I had 12 banker's boxes full of notes. But it was just right there. And yes, of course, that's exactly how it had been. Ideas would come, and there would be a confidence about those ideas. They would resonate. They would just resonate on and felt like the right ideas, because they would resonate with the vibration that I had already spent years of my life attuning myself to. And I never actually, until I read that, thought about it. Well, no, that's not true. But in fact, I thought about it very early on. I just realized one day that Swami was running the show. I was moving the chairs, but he was running the show. And it was perfect. That's exactly what you want. We're going to pick up, thoughts are universal. We're not making them up anyway. So where do we want to get them from? We want to get them from the source that is consistent with what our lives are about. Once you're sort of in that, it's not like, it's just perfectly natural. It's like we become what we focus on. And if we focus on attunement with this line of masters, we become in tune with this line of masters. Why would we not? They're constantly vibrating and putting out energy. And if we randomly take this idea and read this book and go there and do this, and then, we'll just be getting our ideas from everywhere. And as disciples, one discovers that going deep in one place instead of narrowing you actually gives you access to the whole. Like Swami talks about, if the whole lake is frozen and you try to break through the lake by just patting it with your hands, you can never break through to the expanse underneath. But if you go deep in one place, you drill a hole through the ice, then you have access to the whole lake. And that's what attunement is. That's the power of attunement. That's why the deeper Swami gets with Master, the more he understands everything. The chapter before, when I was just stumbling through all that business about astrology, which was Greek to me, that was the example. Swami was deep with Master, so therefore he could go deep anywhere. So astrology is what he wants to understand, but he's broken through. He knows how to go deep. I can't claim anything like that for myself, but I can see how it would work. I've had enough experience to see where it goes and how it goes. So let's see what else he says here. This doesn't mean overseeing everything they do too meticulously. It doesn't mean breathing down their necks, as it were. Simply offer them your spirit as if to sustain them. Those who tune into you will, in this way, do things better, will accomplish more, and will unite to create our harmonious whole in the overall work, instead of becoming separate entities, each going his own direction. So again, that's where you become a spiritual family. Everybody's trying to be in tune with the same reality, and those who are picking up that same reality naturally understand and work with each other. One of the things that happened after Swami died was Swamiji used to bring us all together on a regular basis because he would be somewhere and everyone would come, gradually even from all over the world. And there's had to be a more deliberate effort to stay connected to each other, because it doesn't just flow out of the natural rhythm of the year as it did before. But as long as we're all trying to work together to be in tune with what he wanted of us, then that same wonderful. And it will continue to be the definition and the experience of Ananda as long as enough individuals commit themselves to staying in tune with that consciousness, because Swamiji's more present than ever. Not less, but rather more. There was one more thought I had there. Let me see if I can think about it. Oh, I was remembering. In all the years that it took when I was very actively involved in developing this community, which in the last 10 years, the last decade especially, there's been, on my part, increasing withdrawal to the point where I'm emeritus, is the word that I like to use, in terms of actual local responsibilities. But in all those 20-some years before, there were only 2 times when Swami ever, that I remember, gave a direct suggestion. He would listen, he would advise, but where he really said yes or no to something. Once we were going to dissolve the ashram house before we had an alternative to it. Swami thought that was a really bad idea. And at one point we thought someone was going to give us a retreat property in Santa Cruz. We thought it was a gift. And we thought having a retreat close to the Bay Area, and this was like in the early 90s, just really early. And it turned out they wanted to sell it to us, but at this moment we thought they wanted to give it to us. And so we said to Swami, we can start a retreat right here in the Bay Area. Swami said, if you started a retreat at the Bay Area, he said, the expanding light it'll just decimate the attendance at the expanding light, which comes largely from the Bay Area. He said, I think we need that retreat like we need a hole in the head, is what he said. And he said it somewhat humorously, but he said, like a hole in the head. We need that like we need a hole in the head. We just don't have the staff, we don't have the bandwidth. He didn't think we had the bandwidth. And he must have known also that it was not really a gift, so there was no money to buy it. But it was so funny because it was so odd for Swami to be so definite and just say no to anything. He would always consider it and think about it and help us to understand if it was a good or bad idea. And so when he just said, we need that like we need a hole in the head, those of us who were listening, we just started to laugh. Then we started just, riffing off of it. Playing the psychic, getting the messages. I'm getting the feeling he doesn't approve of this. Is anyone picking up the same vibe? It was like we didn't know what to do. And then it all turned out to be just folly anyway. But it was such a funny moment because it was so unusual. It was so unusual for him just to say, that's a really bad idea. He just never did. He always helped us to understand why it was or wasn't a good idea. But that one, he just really did not want to see that one go anywhere. 15 or 20 years later, he said, the expanding light is well established now. If you want to have a retreat, go ahead. We were never actually able to bring it to fruition, but it was fun that he said we could. So let's at least start this next one. This is August of 1998. All three of these letters are from the same year. It seems to continue. Seems the year he was talking about leadership. This is advice to project leaders on how to win others to your project. It's easy to say, support and win people, but Swami does warn us that it takes patience and willpower. So we don't always have patience and willpower. So he says, they're all of them doing their best, whoever they are, I don't know, as also are we. Correcting them will work best if it comes from them rather than to them. So let me just think what the context would be. I think what was happening is that Swami was guiding certain leaders. It might be about music. It might be in a team of people working on music, but I'm not sure. He was in touch with certain individuals to whom he's writing, which is one or two people, about something that he really wanted to have done. But Swami himself was not the hands-on leader. Whoever he's writing to was the hands-on leader. So they were trying to carry out something that Swamiji had wanted them to carry out, but he didn't want them to impose it just by saying Swami says. So when he says we're trying to do this and they're trying to do it, it was Swami was trying to finesse a situation into unity. And so that's why he says it this way. They're all of them doing their best, as also are we. Correcting them will work best if it comes from them rather than to them, meaning if it occurs to them that this would be a better direction to go, that would be far better than you imposing it on them. As I hinted to you on the phone, let's forget about weeding the garden. It's big and could make us weed conscious rather than flower conscious. He meant, let's stop thinking about what's the things that are going wrong, and we're going to try to pull up the mistakes. He said, we're just going to be starting to think about all the mistakes instead of about the flowers. Plus, he said, it's big. We're not going to be able to solve every problem, and could make us weed conscious rather than flower conscious. Let's work rather on developing our own little patch and on making it beautiful. Now, not knowing the exact circumstances, I'm not quite sure what he means. Maybe people are working parallel. Swami, if we develop what we're doing well, then maybe it'll draw others into it. Don't worry so much about what's going on over there. Advice to project leaders on winning others over. The more successful we are in those efforts, the more the others will tune into that direction and follow it as well as they are able. So it may be that we're working parallel on the same project, and we have one idea of how to make it successful, and they think another way will work better. So let's make our part of it work really well, and then that maybe others will be inspired to listen to us more, instead of spending our time telling them that they're doing it wrong. Without knowing details, I'm having to guess, but that's what makes sense here. The more successful we are in those efforts, the more the others will tune into that direction and follow it as well as they are able. This is where Swami says, too, they're all of them doing their best. They'll follow it as well as they're able. Swami was always very realistic about what you could expect of people. And because he was creative with other people's energy, he paid attention to what their energy really was. He didn't just sit there demanding that everybody match his vibration, or else he wouldn't let them play the game. He looked to see what people had in them to contribute, and then tried to find a way to open it open so they could contribute. That's quite a different way of thinking. But if we try to tell them how to proceed, especially if our advice isn't earnestly sought, in other words, if nobody invites us to speak and we just start telling people how to do things, it's not going to go well. They'll only become tense, thinking, are they trying to tell me I'm wrong? This is, I wish I could be more precise about this, because then I could help you. I think the three of you will make a great team. I don't know who he's talking to. Especially if you work together with love and joy, light-heartedly, even good-humoredly, about any differences between you and others. These differences, as we know by now, from a long life of trying, are simply bound to arise, and in fact needn't always be a bad thing. So he says, when you see differences between yourself and others, behave with love, joy, lightheartedness, and even good humor, instead of being so serious about everything that's different. I suggest that you let others have their own space to come around in their own way and in their own time. I remember I was working on a project, and the people who were very influential were just feeling they had to do things in a certain way, which I really thought was a waste of time. And Swami said, he said, just let the horse have its head for a while and it'll run and then it'll gradually come back to the stable. And that was exactly right. Just don't be too particular. Just let them try out the way they wanted to do it. And they did, and it ran, and it resolved itself, just as Swami said it would. The change, to the extent that it happens, may take a few of them several months. What of it? If we ourselves do a good thing and don't give anyone the slightest impression of self-righteousness, I think we'll build up a magnetism that will draw everyone into a new vortex. So once again, develop positive magnetism ourselves. Don't worry about what other people are doing. Be lighthearted about the differences between our ideas and theirs. And then as the energy begins to flow, people will become interested in it. It will become attractive. You see, that's how Swamiji was a leader. It was so much fun to follow what he was doing. He didn't have to tell us to follow it. We wanted to follow it because good things happen. So he's suggesting the same. And this is where he says, this music scene is so important. I'm very anxious that it be approached harmoniously. So somehow this is all about the music. And Swami never wanted to get his way in a disharmonious manner. Because if disharmony, if there was too much disharmony, the energy was not going to work anyway. And the music is too important. Let's move carefully. Moreover, this is the only way to make it work, and I think it can work gloriously to everyone's lasting joy. Then he says, humor is often the best nectar for making things work. It often does so much more effectively than strong medicine. So Swami was always so helpful. He was always, he always, we started a little late because of the tech problem, but I'm going to stop at this point in the book. But I'm just going to say a couple of things. Swami, in his leadership lessons in the Material Success course, he actually uses he uses me as an example. He uses the way he handled me as an example without mentioning my name. But he talks about a project that he wanted to do. In that case, it was actually a political action project in our local Nevada City government. It was, the director of the planning department had been promoted from being a secretary. She was not trained or qualified for her position, but Nevada County at that point was such a backwater, it didn't really matter. But when Ananda came in, and we had a very complicated planning problem from the point of view of county regulations, she absolutely had no idea what to do with us. Swami immediately perceived that our development was going to be absolutely frozen as long as that woman had authority over us. And he knew human nature so much better than us. This was 1976. He made the decision, and it was the right decision, that we had to get this woman out of that position. And in fact, she had already been investigated by the grand jury for incompetence, and the grand jury had recommended to the Board of Supervisors that she be fired, but the Board of Supervisors had failed to act. So Swamiji took up the cause of getting her fired. And it was 1976, and he created something that he called the Bicentennial Liberty Committee, because it was the 200th anniversary of the United States. And we started this political action campaign. I've written this up in the 2 books I've written about Swami. And in the end, we got her fired. And a competent director came in, and as soon as the competent director was there, our whole project went forward. Now, many people did not believe that getting her fired was possible or desirable because she had all this power over us and blah, blah. And Bicentennial Liberty Committee was a pretty strange idea. And so in his leadership thing, Swami talks about the fact that you study the individuals, you get to know the people that you're trying to work with, and you understand what motivates them. And he knew that I was motivated by humor. And this was a very serious thing, but he writes, he presented it to me as a madcap adventure, that we were just going to do something slightly outrageous, and that it would be fun. And what did I care? If he wanted me to do it, it was fine with me. But that's exactly, and he carried it out with me that whole time. He always used humor, and we always laughed about what we were doing. And even when we were being very serious, we were always doing it with a very light heart because he knew it would motivate me. And then I was very enthusiastic, and many people in the community just could never see it and never got part of it. But I was amused, I was lighthearted, I was enthusiastic, and I got enough other people involved that we were able to carry it through. But lighthearted and humor. And Swami didn't bother to argue with anyone else. He didn't bother to try to tell people that, they should feel differently. They didn't want to be part of it. That was fine. And he was deadly serious, but he did it in a very lighthearted way and created a vortex. And by the end, we got a lot more people involved in it. And by the end, we got exactly the result he wanted. But he made it work with that light spirit. Just exactly. It was brilliant. I didn't know at the time. It was only in retrospect, and even actually when I read it there, when I read it in that many years later, I thought, yeah, that's exactly what he did. He did it exactly perfectly, and it worked with me. I'm going to tell you one more thing where Swami worked with humor with me. I was a little wild, a little out of control with my energy for many years of my life, but especially for that first decade. And I would often speak without thinking, and I would say things, I don't know why I would say them. And I really wanted to try to just think before I spoke. And I spent a lot of time with Swami, and I started trying to just discipline myself. So when I heard myself talking and I wasn't sure I wanted to be talking, I would say, oh, never mind, like that. And sometimes I would actually put my hand over my mouth just to get myself to quiet down. So I was just doing this as it seemed like a good idea at the time. And I was a week or two into this little project of saying, oh, never mind, whenever I didn't want to keep talking. And one evening had been at Swami's for the evening, and I was just about to leave. And Swami, we're standing in the doorway, and Swami sort of folds his arms and gets very serious, and he looks at me very seriously. He said, I was meditating today, Asha, and Babaji came to me, and he had a message for you. Oh my gosh, my breath stopped, my heart stopped. The blood, what blood there was in me was running backwards in the veins. I was just like this. And then, and what Babaji wanted you to know is, oh, never mind. He said just like that. I went, oh my God. And I said, it's that annoying? He said, yes. Would you please stop? I said, absolutely, sir. But, my feelings weren't hurt, nothing, because he just got me so good. And we were just laughing so hard that there was just, then he told me I was being an absolute moron and would I please straighten up. But I could never have heard those words. But having sucked me down the tube of a really good prank, he knew that was how to make it work for me. And there was just so much of everything you want in a friend from that he, this is how you work with people. This is how you love them and really help them. So I hope it inspires you as well. God bless you.